Hello, my name is Patrice Onwuka. I'm the director for the Center of Economic Opportunity at the Independent Women's Forum. Welcome to our policy chat. Now, the Center for Economic Opportunity, or CEO, is our home for economic, labor, and tech policy. So please make sure you like this video, follow our work at iwf.org, and be sure to sign up for our monthly newsletter for commentary and analysis. Go to iwf.org/CEO. So as I said, welcome to our policy chat series. This is a series where we tackle different policy areas with a focus on women. Now, last time we did this, we explored women in the labor force and what we were expecting to happen this fall, given that schools were reopened and that so many businesses were also back online. We were discussing whether or not we would see movement of more women back to the labor force. And interestingly, we were on point with a lot of the things we said. And so you can go back and watch that video on iwf.org. But today, what we wanted to do is, as we head into the spookiest time of year, talk about Washington's biggest and scariest plans in recent history. So Democrats in Congress are working furiously overtime every day to hammer out an agreement on President Biden's domestic spending agenda. This $3.5 trillion bill, although it could be less than that, is going to be advanced through a partisan budget reconciliation process, which means it only requires 50 votes and the vice president casting the tie-breaking vote. So it's not bipartisan, it's actually very partisan. It's also wasteful, costly, and frankly, counterproductive to worker and parental freedom. And it will deepen inflation, which I know we all feel. Speaker Pelosi calls it, quote, transformative, but she never tells us what she means or what our country will be transformed into. She's also hiding the contents of the bill, which is being negotiated as we speak. So today, we are going to explore some of the provisions that are included in this bill. They've been billed as good for workers and good for families and good for women, but we think they're actually going to do the opposite. So joining me today are three powerhouse women in the policy space that you need to be following if you don't already. First, we have Carrie Lucas, who is the president of the Independent Women's Forum. Next, we have Rachel Ressler, Senior Research Fellow of the Heritage Foundation. She's actually back with us today for the second chat. And Jennifer Butler, Senior Policy Advisor at the State Policy Network. As I said, if you don't follow them on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and wherever they are, you need to start today. Ladies, welcome to today's policy chat.
Thanks, Patrice.
Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Well, I tried to lay out where we are right now. I think everybody hears daily that, something's being negotiated. Maybe it's $3.5 trillion. Maybe it's going to be less. Nobody really knows anything. And frankly, we don't know what the final bill will be until we actually see it. But I just want to do a quick round robin from you guys. We are diving right in here. What do you find most concerning in this bill or about this bill? So Carrie, I'm going to let you kick it off, then Rachel, then Jennifer round us up.
Sure. I think that one of the measures that really is like an emblem of what I think is so bad about the bill is the childcare provision. It's one of those that sounds really nice. I think a lot of people, when they hear the back and forth on what is in the bill, a lot of them say, hey, a lot of parents really do need help with childcare. That seems reasonable. But actually, I think that this is one of those tremendously pernicious measures, because really what this is the federal government would become the biggest player in daycare and childcare. That's the price tag on this, whether it's $400 billion or many times that. They're obviously, with so many measures, they're trying to game it by phasing out some of the subsidies over time to make it look like it would spend less. But I think the most important thing to realize when it comes to the childcare thing is, no matter how much this cost, if this really was kind of free and somehow the money needed to pay for it was falling from the sky and didn't affect anything, you would still, I think Americans should still say, it is not the federal government's role to be in charge of our preschool and child care system, just because that's not the role of government. And with all this money is going to come in tremendous meddling in terms of content and what kids are learning. And I think it's a fundamental change in how our relationship between citizen and state. And I think it's really bad news.
Yeah, and building off of that, I just think that holistically looking at this big package, there's an assumption that everyone in America is struggling and that politicians in Washington know better than those individuals and those families and those small business owners how to make the decisions that are best for them. When we look at what's been proposed, this is a cradle to grave entitlement society that attempts to anchor Americans to government dependency instead of empowering them to thrive on their own. And then you couple that with these command economy tactics that are attempting to micromanage small businesses and even entire industries and large businesses. And we have really, they've called it this themselves, a transformation of the American economy.
Right. And just to build on what Rachel said, I think finding something bad in this bill is like shooting fish in a barrel. There is just so much in it. But I really am concerned about what the policies mean for this bill. We talk about the $3.5 trillion. We know that the price tag will probably change. We got to focus on the policy, right, rather than the price tag. So I'm glad we're having this conversation today. But I think the overall impact of all these policies combined means it's going to continue to erode the workforce. It's going to continue to erode entrepreneurship in America. And this is the wrong time for these wrong policies. We are dealing with massive inflation. We are dealing with just really kind of odd labor markets at this point in time. And anything that Washington, D.C. does to stack the deck up against employers, employees, and the ability for moms like me to be an independent contractor and choose how I work and when I work is just wrong for our country.
Well, you guys all hit on some really key issue areas that we're going to dive into a little bit more. I would just add in what's concerning is that President Biden and frankly, Democrats in Congress don't have a mandate from the American people to transform this economy, transform this nation into, frankly, what is would be a socialist utopia. I think a lot of these ideas, as you guys are hitting on, really means ceding control from the individual, the family, the worker to someone in Washington. And I think that would be a huge shift in how we approach look at the role of government in our lives, and how it's doing so by leaving half of the country out of the conversation. And so that's why we are having this conversation today, because we represent those voices who want to push back, who don't want to accept what is being billed as transformative, but really transformative into a socialist nation rather than an independent, capitalist, free enterprise society. So Carrie, let's kick off with you. I want you to talk more about universal pre-K and this whole childcare discussion. You touched on it. You kind of gave us a nice teaser, appetizer, but what is part of it? And you kind of said it, but I hear from people, well, free childcare sounds good, or it sounds really, it's expensive. I mean, I don't know about you guys. I have a kid in a Catholic school pre-K. Hey, we're paying out of pocket for this. So shouldn't the government help us all?
Yeah, Patrice, I do think that a lot of people start from that, especially I think that when you hear the conversation about childcare, and you think about government intervening to help people, you usually think, I think that our assumption is we're going to be helping people who can't afford childcare or are really struggling, that this is going to be kind of a means tested program. And the thing is with this program and with the government approach to it is it's done on a sliding scale, but really this is, again, a cradle to grave, and everybody, they want a safety net where everybody's is in the safety net, which makes it, very different from how we kind of usually conceive of these kind of support systems. And I think before we kind of talk about what the government solution is to this, I do think it's important to take a step back and define what problem they're supposed to be solving. Because it's important for people to recognize that while, yes, there are a lot of people who are spending a lot of money on childcare, there's also a lot of people who don't use childcare, who have little kids and are making tremendous sacrifices because they believe being at home with their child is best. And those people are really left out of this program. So if you are one of the moms or dads out there who is staying home with your kid and is foregoing an income, this does not have is not going to support you. This is going to be trying to push you to get your kids in childcare. And it's interesting. This is actually a chart from a paper that Rachel just put out. So Rachel, I'd love for you to build on this or fill in any holes that I have. But one of the interesting things is when it comes at who is currently uses institutional childcare, the kind that government's going to be funding, it is mostly upper income families. And partially that may be because they can afford it, but there also is this idea that there's a lot of folks in the lower income and kind of working middle class families who are depending on family care, either one parent staying at home or a grandparent is stepping up. And it is, before we kind of jump into government solving this problem, we should recognize that a lot of people don't want their kids in childcare. So this is already, it's not solving the problem that people really have, which is a lack of resources. Sometimes a lot of young parents feel pinched, but that doesn't mean they all want them to go into institutional daycare.
Yeah, and I'll just add on Carrie's points there. When you look at what this subsidy would actually be providing, and on these sliding income scales, this would send $30,000 per year to a couple in DC that has 2 children and makes $343,000. And then if you consider a couple in Mississippi with the same 2 children who makes $53,000, they're going to get about half that, $17,600 in subsidies. And then the family that has a parent that stays home with the children, or even kind of in the middle there, somebody who's working part-time and mom or dad helps out around the house, they get nothing. And what this does actually is it creates this whole new tiered structure of childcare so that by year 6, every child in America has an entitlement to a quote top tier childcare subsidy. And what that does is it's going to be government is in control of these things. These are going to be highly structured childcare facilities, and you're not going to have access for the faith-based providers, the in-home family networks. They're going to be entirely crowded out. We've already seen in the pandemic-related bills, Congress passed $53 billion worth of funding to help childcares. You know how much of it has been used? 2%. Because there's all these rigid rules and restrictions on it, like having to pay Davis-Bacon prevailing wage and compensation laws. What family provider and what church-based daycare is going to be able to comply with those things? Who's going to be willing to fire all their existing teachers and only hire those who have a college education? What congregation is going to be willing to have their worship area transformed to meet childcare providers at the federal level, their requirements? And it's also important to note that whereas the existing subsidies are available to faith-based and religious providers, this proposal would make those providers recipients of federal funds. And what that does is it says that if you receive these, if you're a subsidized childcare provider, that could compromise your ability to run your programs as you want or to hire workers as you want based on your beliefs.
And 2 quick points from the state perspective on this particular child care provisions. I mean, the money is going to the states. There's a lot of appropriations at this point in the package. But, as Reagan famously said, there's nothing more nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. So what happens when those appropriations run out and you have a new entitlement program? States theoretically might have to fill in that gap, setting them up for fiscal cliffs, or basically go back to Congress for more money. The other point, too, is that we are seeing in, honestly, a lot of blue states colluding with labor unions to skim dues money off childcare providing stipends. This is happening in California, Illinois, Washington, you can name the states. And this is free money for unions. So large appropriations going to childcare providers. Unfortunately, the unions are right at the front of the line getting their coffers filled up.
Well, you know what? This is a great discussion as we're going into kind of the working aspect. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, Jennifer, and pick up on what you're talking about. You're specifically referring to unions and how they are playing in kind of the childcare space, but they're also playing in other areas in this massive bill. So I would love for you to talk about, what you're seeing as most concerning from a labor perspective.
Yeah, and you have done such an amazing job just pointing out the various labor provisions and packages that have been running through this Congress. And I think you've been doing a lot of work on PRO Act and the impact it would have on independent contractors and freelancers. Fortunately, because this is a reconciliation package, and theoretically the only provisions that are supposed to be in this package are budget or have some sort of fiscal hook, the full package of provisions in the PRO Act, which basically is the Christmas wish list of labor unions, are not in here. But there's a slew of other labor gimmies, changing the employer-employee relationship, basically tilting the scales in favor of unions in order to unionize. So a few things, if I can run down a few, like a laundry list of a few things. And we do have, I think we'll be sharing a link to a fantastic report that's up there from the Institute for American Worker. As I mentioned before, right, there's restrictions on employers. And basically it adds employer and employee communications during unionization attempts to the list of unfair labor practices. And it's going to add an increased significant fine, basically up to $50,000 per employee. So let me give you some practical examples, right? Imagine you have a small business and all of a sudden a union is trying to attempt to unionize it. You want to talk to your employees to find out, okay, is there something else we can do? Do you have grievances? Can I improve the workplace somehow? Even having those basic conversations would set an employer up for those fines. They can't have staff meetings to discuss attempted unionization. So basically, this really puts employers in a very bad and awkward position and tilts the scale to labor unions. And the other thing that's important to note is that $50,000 per employee fine, it's kind of double, like it's done twice, meaning not only can the business be fined $50,000 per employee, but the owner themselves can be fined $50,000. So think about a business with 50 employees. That could mean up to $5 million in fine for one particular labor grievance. And so we know this is going to set up and incentivize labor unions to come out and put all sorts of grievances out there. A couple other quick things too. Employers in the middle of a strike can't hire permanent replacements for their striking workers. So day-to-day operations are going to be at the mercy of labor unions threatening a strike. And also too, the House version includes a $250 above the line deduction for union dues. And this does not apply to agency fee payers. So an agency fee, basically, if you want to have union services, but not pay for union politics, you can pay for just those services by paying an agency fee. This IRS deduction does not allow agency fee payers to get that deduction. So this really is using IRS code to pay and fund union political campaigns. Now, Patrice, you mentioned, and we mentioned right off the bat about independent contracting and freelancing, and I know you all have done a tremendous amount of work on it. And while outright making independent contracting illegal is not in this package, there are some real concerning appropriations in here. And specifically, it would increase the funding by $2 billion for Department of Labor's Labor Hour and Wage Division. It's a specific division within DOL. And right now they're beginning to roll back Trump era protections that basically allowed free market to encourage independent contractors and gig workers to flourish, especially too during COVID. As a working mom, I appreciated being an independent contractor when I first had my children. And so we're not only going to see this wage and hour division significantly ramp up, but to add insult to injury, the person that ran it under Obama is going to be taking the reins of it soon. And under Obama, he greatly restricted independent contracting. And then finally, it also opens up employers to those hefty unfair labor practice fines, right? The $50,000 an employee fine if employers or employees are unfairly labeled independent contractors. Mm-hmm. So, incentives matter, right? And de-incentives matter. This really is going to make an employer, somebody having a company, think twice before they offer and reach out to independent contractors.
Yeah, I'm glad that you explained that, particularly that last one, Jennifer. And I can imagine that a Biden administration Department of Labor, which has already scaled back or stopped, really helpful policies for independent contractors from the Trump administration, they could say, well, why don't we maybe change the definition of an independent contractor or an employee in a way that maybe then allows for the provisions in this plan to then kick in, and an employer or a company then gets slapped with the fines, because they're innocently classifying someone as an independent contractor who has now the classification has been changed under a new kind of regulation. So a little in the weeds, but I do think it's still one of those concerning areas for us to keep an eye on. So let's stay with the theme of workplace. And Jennifer, you were talking about flexibility in the workplace, and I think that's a huge area that so many women care about, especially when you have a baby. And so let's talk about paid leave, which is probably gets the most ink other than climate change provisions about this bill. So I'm kicking it over to you, Rachel. Tell us what is going on with the childcare, the paid leave discussion in this bill, and why does it sound like a good thing, but maybe it's not going to be?
So the paid family leave program, the federal government paid family leave program, is one of the things now that's kind of up for debate and in the toss up of whether or not it's going to stay in there, whether it'll be reduced. So what has been proposed is actually pretty different from what Democrats have proposed in the past. It does start with this baseline, essentially the Family Act, that provides up to 12 weeks of paid family leave for workers, whether it's having a child or a medical condition of your own or caring for a family member. And it's about 70, 80% replacement rate, so it's not 100% there. But what is unique in this proposal and the $3.5 trillion reconciliation package is that they're going to use taxpayer dollars to provide funding for paid family leave that is already out there. There are about 10 states that have programs that are already providing this. And there are many employers who are already providing paid family leave. And instead of just allowing those flexible and accommodating policies that employers are providing to keep place, they're going to come in and have a federal government takeover. I mean, we've seen an increase of 64% in the number of workers that have access to paid family leave over the past 5 years. And exactly as that is going up, now the federal government wants to come in and essentially say to workers, hey, if you like the paid family leave program you have, now you're going to have to go through the federal government instead and go through this bureaucracy. This is not what most workers want, obviously. So instead of being able to just simply email your boss and say, I need to take leave tomorrow for a doctor's appointment, or I'm going to be out for a couple of weeks for this or that, you're going to have to now go through a bureaucracy, submit the paperwork, the medical forms. And, instead of even emailing your boss, you might have your email cut off completely. That's what's happened to some women when they have taken paid family leave in these states that have programs, because there's a fear that there will be a lawsuit if they ask their workers to do any work or if they do anything while they're on leave. And so you can forget these more flexible and accommodating policies. But then on the other hand, it's problematic for the employers as well, because they lose that ability to just work directly with their employees. Instead of being able to talk with one another, they're going to be disconnected. Workers will have the right to take leave without telling their employer, and then to notify them 7 days later, oh, I decided to take paid family leave. And when you look at what happens now under FMLA, that just allows workers, if you work for an employer that has 50 or more employees, you are entitled to job protected leave. So what that ends up happening in a lot of cases is just widespread misuse and abuse. And there will be workplaces where you have up to 45% of workers who have an FMLA certification. And what that does is essentially allow them to take leave at will. If they're 30 minutes late for work, sorry, I had a migraine, FMLA. If they don't show up on Monday or Friday, sorry, I have a migraine, FMLA. And it's actually been referred to FMLA as the Friday, Monday Leave Act by a lot of workers in these places where it's been abused. It's the most common days for taking it, the Monday after the Super Bowl, the first day of hunting season. If workers are assigned a shift on a holiday, then they are 31% more likely to use FMLA. If it's on a weekend, 75% more likely. So it's really abused in some places, and that's when they're not getting paid. And now you think about, you don't have to notify your employer until later, and you can get paid for it. I mean, I think we can expect the abuse to significantly increase, and it's just breaking that ability for employers and employees to work together the way that COVID-19 has shown. We can have these policies, and we've seen them massively increase, but it needs to be without the overreach of the federal government. But looking at what's actually going to end up happening here is that, the policy they propose, especially when you add in paying for existing paid family leave, that would easily cost $500 billion, if not trillions of dollars over 10 years. And so they realized we can't pay for this. And so now they're talking about scaling it back and maybe starting out with only providing 4 weeks of paid family leave at the beginning and hoping that in the future, Congress will increase that level. But the problem with that is that, yes, you scale it back, but you still get all the consequences. You're still taking out the private sector and taking out the state-based programs and saying the federal government is going to be the one that is in control here. And looking at why would they do this? Why wouldn't they just instead say, hey, let's let the private employers keep paying for theirs and we'll focus on the people who actually need leave, who don't yet have access? I mean, it seems that the goal must be to have a federal takeover and to have politicians be the ones that are in charge of all this. And one final point I want to make is that the goal is to increase access to people who don't have leave right now. And we have seen a big increase in the number of lower wage workers with access now to that leave. But the government programs have consistently failed to do this. And IWF has done a great job of tracking that across different countries, showing how actually these programs are pretty regressive. They tax everybody, and then they don't end up benefiting low-income workers. And it's the same thing in the States. In California, moms in the lowest income group are only 1/5 as likely as those in the highest income group to actually use the program. And even under this proposal now, there are many low-income workers who will simply not qualify because you do have to put rules and regulations in place. And they also don't provide job protection. So it could be the case that if you're one of those lower wage workers and you think you now have access to this program and you go and use it, and then you come back and your employer says, I'm sorry, I don't have to provide you with job protected leave, you've lost your job, a lot of people are going to end up potentially being hurt by it instead.
Carrie, do you want to talk a little bit about tag on here, especially since you head up a small nonprofit organization?
Yeah, it is. I totally appreciate what you just said, Rachel, because, it's interesting. As the head of Independent Women's Forum, we've got about 25 employees now, all of whom are women and who have a lot of babies. We always have a lot of people out on maternity leave. And it's interesting as a small employer, how you approach this. We do provide paid time off. We think that's important. And we provide 6 weeks to every employee. But as a part of that, there's a big conversation. And as and when I get to talk to my employees and say, oh gosh, we have something big coming up. Do you mind sending us, this email or being available for this date? If the federal government gets involved, I won't be able to have that conversation. And I'm going to have to approach employing people very, very differently. And Rachel, you're absolutely right. When you look at places around the world, I actually had the pleasure of living in Europe off and on for about a decade. I lived in Germany and in Belgium and in Austria. And it's interesting because these places are often painted as kind of the paradise for women. And there's so much wonderful subsidies and everyone gets time off. But one of the things that certainly was very evident to me in kind of being in a community of moms there, having a lot of little kids and having babies at the time, is this sense of how hard it was to get a foot in the door. And you'll see when it comes to women in the OECD countries that have very generous paid leave policies, they tend not to be hired and certainly not to be hired in professional positions. And as a boss, I get it because, as somebody, if I'm going to be hiring somebody to take like a really senior position that you need people to show up for, and if you are worrying that somebody's going to take off for in Europe, sometimes as much as 9 months, but even for 12 weeks, or heaven forbid, if they're taking off every Monday and Friday, a lot of people are going to start saying, you know what, this person doesn't seem like a good fit. There will be this natural discrimination against especially younger women of childbearing age, because they are obviously, we all know this, as I think we're all here as moms with kids, that we do tend to have to take a lot of more disproportionately paid family leave. And just one more thing, I think when it's really interesting, Rachel, it sounds, when you were talking about that, I thought it was really, it's brave, because I think that oftentimes when you come out and question the idea of paid leave, you're kind of painted as a monster, and that the only person who would ever use paid family leave is this new mom who just had a C-section and she can't go back to work yet. And of course, we all, I know the four of us would certainly say, of course, I don't want that woman who just had a C-section to have to drag herself back to work. But what we're talking about is creating a massive one-size-fits-all program, which will affect everybody. And it affects workers who are going to have work shifted to them when people do begin abusing paid leave programs. And this includes a lot of hardworking moms and dads out there who are going to be picking up the slack for people who are abusing paid leave. And it also matters for customers. And I think this is something that we saw a lot during COVID, is that when people stop working, when all of a sudden everybody gets to say, oh, I don't want to show up, there's a lot of real hardship for people who depend on services. And I'm thinking specifically of like home health care aides, when there was a tremendous shortage during COVID, because a lot of folks were being paid more not to work than they would to show up and help people. And a lot of elderly and disabled folks really suffered. So we should be careful that, of course, we want to help employees. There needs to be balance. There needs to be some trade-off and responsibilities. And a one-size-fits-all federal government program really discourages that.
Well, and what you said there, Carrie, ties into this notion that there is one rigid structure that would work for everything. This spans across everything, the labor sector, childcare, paid family leave, because everything they're trying to do here is we have this vision. Everybody should work in a formalized job, no independent contracting, no freelancing. You go to a 9-to-5 job, you report to your boss, you're entitled to X, Y, and Z. You put your children in full-time center-directed childcare. And that's not what people want. And the reason that we've actually seen growth in, women's employment, women's earnings, and all these things is that there've been more flexible options out there, and all that's going to be taken away. And as you noted, it's actually going to have adverse impacts on health, on supply chain issues. There was a study out there, Jennifer commented about the ability to replace striking workers. There's an economic analysis titled, "Do Strikes Kill?" And it's nursing strikes. And the inability to replace those workers, that will have severe consequences on the health and even the life of people. And I think that if we look at this, how is this going to impact us as a whole? The supply chain issues and the debacle at the ports in California is just one example. When you have a union that refuses to increase the hours of operation, when you have a state that says 80% of the trucks in this country aren't allowed into our state because of our environmental and our labor laws, of course you're going to have issues where people can't get the things that they need. And that's only going to be exacerbated under this bill.
Wow, that is huge, Rachel. And I think that you tied together all of the threads in these different issue areas really well, and leads us into a discussion about the costs. I mean, we're hearing the price tag being maybe $3.5 trillion now, maybe it's down to $1.9 trillion. But we here talked about the costs that are not measured in dollars and cents, but in lost opportunity, in lost flexibility, in lost parental choices and control. Anybody have thoughts on the pay-fors? I mean, I've seen lots of different analyses about how this is going to be paid for. And from what we understand, it's going to be paid for potentially by a tax on the ultra wealthy now. But do we believe that that the middle class will not be hit with increased cost or other types of or any sort of tax increases through this plan?
Well, Jennifer, I don't know if you want to jump in on any of this. I feel like I was battling last time, but just real quick, I think that whenever we hear this whole idea of taxing the ultra wealthy, I feel like everybody should recognize that this is, one of those absolutely tired political concepts that we know just doesn't work. We simply, we have a lot of America has some very ultra wealthy folks, but not enough to fill the gaps when we're talking about this magnitude of spending. And I think especially, right now, I think Americans of all income levels are seeing that you will not be held harmless no matter what your tax bill is. What you see happening right now with inflation, that is a tax. That is the equivalent of a tax on every single citizen. I know I find this when I go to my grocery store. Like everybody here, I've got a lot of kids and a big family to feed, and I can see in my grocery bills, my heat's just being turning on. Heating bills are supposed to go up between 50%, but maybe 100% higher than they were last year. That is going to hit people very hard. And it is not, the wealthy doesn't care. It doesn't, if you're ultra wealthy, an extra few $100s a month isn't going to hit you. But it does for basically everybody who is not ultra wealthy. And that certainly takes a bite out of your monthly budget. So I do think that regardless of what they say the tax implications are going to be, everyone will absolutely be paying for this when we have this explosion in government spending.
And Carrie, thank you so much for bringing up the home heating bill. I mean, it was AP that reported a couple of weeks ago at least a 50% increase. Yeah. And, there just has been radio silence from those that are pushing this bill on what this means. We've already seen the prices at the gas stations jump up. But we know that this breaks Biden's promise of not increasing taxes on those making less than $400,000, because there are a lot of provisions that are being discussed that would impact families like myself. But, I've heard the negotiations and discussions about the pay-for as being described as like a 7-way seesaw. So lots of things that we're talking about today might go away tomorrow. In fact, I think Rachel or Carrie mentioned early on when we were prepping for this call that the IRS spying provisions to beef up IRS and monitor all the transactions in people's bank accounts might be on its way out, but who knows? But bottom line is that we have to keep talking about the policies and bring them back to how they impact families and businesses and what that means for women and for Americans across this country.
Well, one of the most recent proposals is to now institute a wealth tax. And they're basically saying we want to pay for a transformation of the American economy to create a cradle-to-grave welfare system on the backs of 700 billionaires. I mean, that's 0.00002% of the American population. You really think that you're going to be able to transform the economy by taxing these people? I mean, there's a reason that they become billionaires, and they're going to either figure out how not to pay it, or they're going to move because they don't want to have to pay billions of dollars per year in taxes simply to live in the United States when we're now in a global and a remote economy where they can do that anywhere.
You hit the nail on the head there. I think you all made some extremely important points about how this is going to be paid for. I mean, we actually really don't know how it's going to be paid for because number one, there isn't a confirmed price tag. And number two, there are going to be, I think, gimmicks included in terms of when things expire, how big they are, and whether pre-existing funds are used and moved over to try to help pay for this. But at the end of the day, we as individuals, as consumers, as workers, and as families will get hit whether we're talking about inflation or we're talking about lost opportunities, lost jobs. When an employer is not able to hire a new person or take on an independent contractor because their tax bill is increased. One of the big provisions, pay-fors, would be scaling back, taking back some of that tax decrease that corporations got, and actually raising the corporate tax rate to be less competitive than China and less competitive than some of our other countries around the world. So in the totality, I agree with you here, guys. I don't see this being fully paid for, number one. I think it's going to be passed on, and I think there are going to be costs that are not captured in numbers, but are certainly felt by regular folks every day.
And poll after poll shows that Americans don't want this. This is not what we are talking about sitting around our kitchen table every single day. We're worried about making making sure we have employment opportunities, making the bills work, worried about inflation, worried about our children. We're not worried about remaking America in a socialist vision.
And one other thing I think is that I wish was getting a little more kind of discussion is when you think about the things we've talked about today. And I think one of the challenges, there's so much in it. We haven't even touched on a lot of the insane environmental regulations and kind of the pushing towards the Green New Deal and relying on renewables. But you think about if we were really, like, if this was a functioning democracy and our media was doing the job it's supposed to, everybody would be saying, wait a second. We need to unpack what's happening here and take a vote on this childcare provision and really talk about what is this child provision? What does it mean for families like this? And instead, same with the paid leave. This is a huge change in the American system of government. And yet here we are, and the left is trying to throw all of this into one bill, stick the word in infrastructure in it, and jam it through on a party line 50 vote through the Senate. I mean, this is not how a democracy is supposed to work. This is really how an authoritarian government works, where they try to not have a discussion of what's going on, keep it from the American people, and sneak through as bold things as they can. So I feel like the whole process is something that should be setting off huge alarms. And you don't have to be able to oppose it. I feel like Senator Manchin at a couple times has said, why can't we hit pause? Please keep that up, because you're right. Like, we can talk about it, and maybe the Americans will decide that they do want some of these things that we think are bad ideas. But at least we would know that we're doing it with our eyes open instead of having it just pushed through without really people knowing what's happening to them.
And back to a state perspective, I mean, this takes the idea of federalism out the window. It federalizes programs that should be handled at the state. There's a reason why there's a Florida and there's a reason why there's a California. People can choose to live in either. Good example is the Medicaid expansion. They're talking about propping up a new federal program that would basically do a workaround of states that chose not to expand Medicaid, and then put people on this new federal program. So there's a slew of things like that in this package. But you're right, Carrie. I mean, we could spend months and months going through, and we should have that conversation. Unfortunately, it's being jammed through.
Well, to your point, I have a list of some of the interesting and insane, frankly, ideas in the bill. Thanks to Heritage Foundation, your folks over there, Rachel. I mean, pushing Green New Deal in our universities, indoctrinating college students around environmental justice, just so that you can build, different campus buildings, new incentives for illegal immigration. Illegal immigrants will be eligible to take advantage of free new college. Oh, and by the way, free 2-year college for everyone who wants it. Boy, everything is in here. Radical abortion ideas there, driving up the cost, green new energy provisions that would increase our utility bills. I think, Jennifer, you were hitting on some of these. Kickbacks for green new energy special interest groups, creating squads that enact equity provisions across the entire, across different federal agencies. It's the list goes on, and I don't even think that we can chip the surface of all of the different provisions that are in here. But I'm with the last couple of minutes that we have here. I really want to just spend a moment or two tying all these threads together that you guys have done so well, and give you like a final show of hands question. But I do think that something that we've kind of touched on, but is really fundamental change, is also about work and the prioritization, the value of work. The fact that some of these welfare provisions, whether it's the extending the child tax credit, which I guess 30 or 60 million families have suddenly gotten and are getting in 6-month every month for the next 6 months to the end of the year. This idea that it's being decoupled from work, so no expectations of going into a job, and if you actually need the extra help, the federal government is there to provide that. And in lots of different provisions, there is no expectations of you to lift a finger to do anything. And that, I think, goes against something that's in the spirit of our nation, of this, that our can-do spirit is we do, not we sit back and wait. And so when you say, oh, well, we're just going to continue to flood American households with cash, regardless of the whether they need it or not, and regardless of whether or not they're looking for work, trying to find work, or working, that does, I think, something to the psyche of the worker and the psyche of just regular people. Frankly, it turns the clock back on, beyond the 1990s, when President Bill Clinton pushed for welfare reform that was dependent on work, that said, let's bring the resources to the people who actually want to move their lives forward by getting that briefcase or getting that foot in the door. And frankly, that hurts the individual in the long run when they are staying out or incentivized to stay out of the workforce. So,
and Patrice, I'm so glad you brought this up, because I've actually been, looking at the welfare components too, and looking back at that speech that Clinton made in 1996 when he signed that historic welfare reform. And he quoted Robert Kennedy, who said, "Work is the meaning of what this country is all about. We need it as individuals. We need it to sense it in our fellow citizens. And we need it as a society and as a people." And that is the exact opposite of what we are seeing in this bill today. And it just shows what a stark contrast it is that you had a Democrat politician quoting another Democrat about the importance of work and how that can transform people and taking them out of an exile of being not in the labor force and just breaking cycles of poverty. And we're doing the opposite here.
Exactly. All right. Well, at 1:45, I promised I would keep it short. Last question, show of hands. Who thinks this bill will pass?
I think something will. Not this.
Something.
I'm an optimist. I'm saying no.
I'm joining you, Carrie.
I'll probably be wrong. I'm saying
our part. We're trying to educate the American people to know what's in it. And if Congress wants to go incrementally or provision by provision, Jennifer, as you said, then that's the kind of fight that we should be having. Well, ladies, thank you so much for spending your lunch hour with me here, unpacking what's in this $3.5 trillion bill. You guys have shared a ton of information and great resources. We're going to make sure that those are linked in the blog post where this video will live on our website. Please, if you do not follow Carrie, Rachel, and Jennifer, please do it now. Follow them on social media, visit their work. They are putting out a ton of content on a regular basis. So ladies, thank you again for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Patrice.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Awesome. And to our audience, thank you so much. So don't miss the next chat. We're going to be talking about tech this time around. It's coming up very soon. And for you to know when it is, you need to sign up for our newsletter. It's called The Pointer. We get right to the point. So visit iwf.org/CEO. That's our Center for Economic Opportunity. You can sign up for our newsletter and stay in the know. Until next time, we hope you will be well, strive, and thrive. Take care.